The tires spat gravel like a dare, and then the rental car was a smear of taillights devoured by the highlands. Wind rushed back into the silence, lifting my hair, needling my cheeks, tugging at the hem of the pantsuit I had chosen with care for this wonderful family trip. I stood with my suitcase on a tuft of grass, if you could call these stubborn clumps of heather a square, and listened to the echo of my daughter's laughter thin into the hills. "Get out," she'd said, with the same precise cruelty she'd used on suitors, bosses, waiters, me. "Let's see how tough you are when you can't get home." Then Brian gunned it, as if abandoning a 67-year-old woman were a competitive sport he meant to win. For a long time, I couldn't tell you if it was a minute or 5 I didn't move. The air had that iron smell that comes just before rain. Somewhere, sheep bleated as if their shared astonishment needed voicing. There were ruins across the lane, the broken ribs of an old church ribbing the sky, and a square of low buildings stitched together by a slick ribbon of road. The highlands make even human drama look small. I suppose that's why Jessica chose them. Make me feel small enough, she'd always believed, and I would fold. The shock hit me first like a slap, then like a tremor. Underneath it, something older stirred a stubbornness that had kept the lights on through lean years and worse. But stubbornness needs a plan, and plans require oxygen, so I breathed. I counted what I had. 1 suitcase, 1 dead cell phone, no charge, no service, 1 wallet with 43 pounds in mixed coins and notes, 1 woman whose own daughter had declared war and didn't mind spectators. I looked down at my hands, nails painted a polite shell pink for vacation, and thought, so this is how it begins. Rewind. 3 days earlier, I'd walked into Edinburgh Airport in a freshly pressed navy pantsuit and a silk scarf that had once felt like a talisman. Jessica glanced up from her phone and performed an eye roll so theatrical it deserved a program note. "Mom, really? A librarian costume?" she'd said, loudly enough that Brian snorted without looking up. "At least she matches the castles," he murmured, thumb still flicking. I laughed because that's a mother's first defense. Alchemize humiliation into humor, pretend you don't mind. I told myself we'd reset once we settled in. We were here to be together. Surely that still meant something. It meant separate hotel rooms, because everyone needs their space. It meant me at the reception desk, smiling as I handed over my card while they wandered toward the bar. It meant days paced to their appetites. Brian needing that tasting menu, Jessica needing the leather tote, and me paying because it kept the peace, and because keeping the peace had once been how we survived. When they paused at a cafe, I took out my new camera, my small extravagance, and photographed whatever held still long enough. Stone spires against a sudden blue, a busker with the patience of saints, a puddle holding a perfect shard of sky. For a moment, I tricked myself into believing we were almost happy. On the 3rd morning, Brian jingled keys with the delight of a teenager and announced a scenic drive through the highlands. "You'll love it, Margaret," he said, laying on my name with a condescension he mistook for courtesy. I squeezed into the back with my camera bag and the map they wouldn't consult, and the city gave way to a quilt of fields stitched with dry stone walls. The light kept changing, pouring itself into valleys and then fleeing, as if the sky couldn't decide what mood to wear. Purple heather, glassy streams, a bridge like a knuckled hand. I leaned forward to frame a shot, the lens fogging as I breathed. "Could you not photograph every sheep?" Jessica said, looking back at me, her face set to low boil. "You're making the whole car vibrate." I told her I wanted to remember this time. The words landed between us like an accusation. She exchanged a look with Brian, the kind that skips across a marriage like a stone it doesn't sink, but you see the ripples. "Actually, Mom, we should talk," she said, and it was astonishing how quickly the air thinned. It wasn't a conversation, it was a summation. I was always there, always interfering, always expecting. As if the years of babysitting on short notice, and the strings-free loans, and the quiet errands that keep a household afloat had been part of a conspiracy against their independence. She spoke with the righteous exhaustion of someone narrating a burden she'd rehearsed, and Brian hummed confirmation in the driver's seat. I tried to locate the breach. Was it the time I turned up with soup when she had the flu? Was it the time I asked if the kids had winter boots? Was it the time I said I missed her? Every mother learns there is a ledger you will never see, only feel, when it's thrown at your feet. We came over a rise, and the village appeared Kilbride, according to a leaning sign, 6 stone buildings hunched together against the weather like conspirators. The church ruin stood apart, its bones open to the sky. "This will do," Jessica said, cool as a receptionist. The car stopped. "Get out." It was almost boring, the way cruelty becomes a procedure once you've practiced it enough. "Don't make a scene," Brian added, as if I might stage a protest that would embarrass them in front of the heather. I got out. My suitcase thunked onto the grass. I heard the engine's eager rev, the wet clatter of gravel. I saw my own reflection in the back window, ghost past sturdy, gray-haired, ridiculous, and then the car vanished around a bend and took their noise with it. Wind stepped back into the space they'd left, carrying the faintest scent of peat and something metallic. My legs prickled with the cold. I told myself, "You raised a child alone. You survived a husband who left the year your daughter's shoulders sharpened into defiance. You paid off a mortgage one coupon at a time. This is one more problem. Solve it." The silent inventory again. 43 pounds, a dead phone, a face I refused to let collapse. Across the lane, the church's stones were furred with lichen, the color of old coins. Swallows stitched the distance with quick black dashes. A postbox the red of childhood stood on a tilted pole like a bright joke. The door of one building post office was latched. Another had drawn curtains and a pot of exhausted geraniums. Somewhere beyond the square's damp breath, I could swear I heard music, not bagpipes wailing across a cliché, but a violin or a fiddle sawing out something lively enough to have bones. I picked up the suitcase and felt the old ache at the base of my spine bloom. I shifted the handle and told the ache it could speak later. "Find a phone," I said out loud, because speaking makes things real. "Get a charge, get to a town with buses, get to Edinburgh, get home." Each verb fell into place like a rung on a ladder. I imagined the receptionist at our hotel in the city, her eyes sliding away as she searched for a policy that could help. I imagined Jessica waking in fresh sheets, sprawled in victory. I imagined walking into my kitchen back in Minnesota and putting the kettle on as if you could boil shock away. Then I imagined what I did not want to. A desk drawer at home with bank statements I had not looked at closely. A signature I did not remember signing. The slow bleed a person can orchestrate if she knows your habits, your passwords, your softness. The thought skittered away. I let it go because it was too much for now. I would allow myself one truth at a time. The wind pushed at my back like a stern ant. I rolled the suitcase toward the buildings, wheels complaining against the cobbles slick with mist. The square was not a square so much as a widening of road and intention. The sign above a door on the far side creaked, half its paint scabbed away by weather. A gull laughed high and rude, finishing a joke I hadn't heard. I stopped under the jut of a lintel to catch my breath and listen. There it was again, the thread of music, bright as a vein of quartz in dark rock. It came from farther up the lane, where a wooden sign hung by 2 chains and swung like a metronome. Light, very faint, breathed behind a window smeared by weather. Warmth has a color. I could see the suggestion of it, an amber promise. I thought of opening the door and saying, "I'm American. My daughter left me here. May I use your phone?" The words sounded both ridiculous and exactly true. The rain started in earnest thin pins that stitched into my scalp and ran down my neck, but I didn't mind. I had decided I would ask for help. I would look whoever stood behind that counter in the eye and tell the simplest version of the story until I could bear the complicated one. I tugged my scarf tighter, set my shoulders, and began to walk toward the light. The music was real, not a trick of tired ears. A fiddle, perhaps, or a violin. It lilted in a way that caught the edges of sorrow and turned them playful. My suitcase wheels snagged and stuttered over the cobbles as I followed it toward the wooden sign that swung like a pendulum in the wind. The Shepherd's Rest, Inn, and Public House. Through smeared panes of glass, I glimpsed warmth, the buttery glow of firelight, and moving silhouettes. I stood outside that door far longer than pride allowed. I imagined how the words would sound. My daughter left me on the roadside like rubbish. Could I borrow your phone? The shame prickled hotter than the drizzle now soaking through my scarf. Yet the alternative, standing in the square until the rain carved me into a relic, was no option. So, I pressed the latch. The wood groaned, the hinge protested, and I stepped inside. Conversation died instantly. It wasn't polite fading, but a severed cord. 7, maybe 8 locals stared. Their silence pressed harder than the highland wind. I summoned my best Midwestern manners. "Evening," I said, as though this were simply another Tuesday. "Sorry to intrude, but I wondered if I might use your phone." I seemed to have found myself in a bit of a situation. Behind the bar stood a woman in her 50s, hair pulled back, face lined more with weather than age. Her accent, when she finally spoke, was broad and warm. "American, are ye? And what brings you to Kilbride with a suitcase at this hour?" The absurdity struck me like a spark. I laughed, not joy but hysteria, the kind that bubbles when life tips into farce. "My daughter," I managed between gasps, decided I was a burden she could no longer carry, so she left me here. Silence. Then the bartender Moira, as I later learned, snorted. "Well then, she's a right fool, isn't she? Sit yourself down and tell us what happened." Over a mug of tea dark enough to wake saints, I spilled the story. Their faces didn't twist in pity, only in concentration. They asked questions both practical and kind. Did I have cash for a hotel? Could I reach Edinburgh by bus? Did I want them to call the police? At that, I faltered. My first instinct screamed yes, but the thought of accusing my own daughter to strangers in uniform froze me. "No police," I said. "Just directions if you'd be so kind." Moira frowned. "Nearest hotel's Stirling, 40 miles south. No buses, and a taxi would cost more than you've got." My wallet's pitiful weight confirmed it. Then her eyes softened. "But we do have a wee room upstairs. £20, breakfast included. It's nothing grand, but clean." Relief buckled me. "I'll take it." The stairway was narrow, the banister worn smooth by decades of hands. A mirror halfway up caught me unaware. My hair had frizzed in the mist, my scarf sagged, and my eyes looked hollow. Yet beneath the shock was a flicker of something fierce, a pilot light refusing to die. Jessica thought she'd discarded me. She had underestimated her mother. The room was plain, a single bed, wool blanket, basin, window over the square. I sat on the edge and began an inventory of survival. Charge the phone, contact the bank, find a way back to Edinburgh, and then home to Minnesota. Charging proved simple. Moira produced a universal adapter like a magician pulling a coin from behind a child's ear. While my phone slowly breathed back to life, she set before me a bowl of thick lentil soup, warm bread, and a glass of wine. "So, what's your plan?" she asked, sitting opposite. "Survive until I can get home, and figure out how my daughter came to hate me enough to do this." Moira gave a humorless laugh. "Families are complicated. My son in Glasgow thinks I'm too old to run this place. Keeps sending me brochures for care homes. As if 20 years of pulling pints suddenly addles the brain." "Children," I said, lifting my glass. "They think they know what's best." "Aye," she clinked. My phone buzzed at last. I snatched it up. Heart lurching, surely Jessica had realized her cruelty was racing back. But the screen glared with another betrayal. Unusual account activity. Debit card declined. Notification after notification. My savings nearly $60,000, now less than $800. I called the bank, throat tight. The representative's voice was calm, rehearsed. Yes, the transfers had been authorized months ago. Yes, they had documents on file. Yes, the recipient was my daughter. Signed, notarized, except I had never signed anything. Jessica hadn't just abandoned me. She had been bleeding me dry for months, setting the stage for this roadside finale. I dropped the phone onto the blanket, hands shaking. Moira read my face before I found words. She poured more wine, steady as stone. "It's worse than I thought," I whispered. "She stole everything." "That's no longer family squabbles," Moira said firmly. "That's abuse, a crime. It's my daughter." Which makes it worse, not better. Her certainty was a rope I could grip. For the first time that night, tears came hard, ragged, unpretty. Moira pushed a box of tissues across the table and waited, neither pitying nor rushing. When the storm passed, she leaned in. "How long can you last on what's left?" "A week, maybe." "Then we've a week to get you on your feet," she said, practical as a general. I'm not about to watch an American grandmother get swindled by her own flesh and blood. Her kindness stung more than Jessica's cruelty. Yet in that sting was something else, resolve, sharp as the Highland wind rattling the window. Tomorrow, Moira promised, we would start fighting back. I lay in the narrow bed, the storm outside rattling the old glass, and whispered into the dark, Jessica, you've no idea who you just tried to break. The morning broke gray, drizzle stippling the square, as though the sky itself felt hungover. I expected despair to settle heavy as the damp wool blanket, but instead, I felt a jolt of clarity. Moira appeared at my door with a mug of coffee so black it could have resurrected the dead. Get dressed, she said, brisk as a commander. We've work to do. What kind of work? I asked. But she was already retreating down the stairs, her footsteps decisive. 20 minutes later, I followed her through a muddy lane behind the inn. The air smelled of peat smoke and wet stone. She carried a key so large it seemed forged for a fairy tale. Ahead, an abandoned stone building crouched against the hills, its roof intact, its walls thick. Used to be a wool warehouse, she explained, working the rusted lock. My husband's grandfather bought it in the 50s, meant to turn it into something profitable. Never did. The hinges groaned as she shoved the door open, and then I gasped. The dim interior revealed a trove hidden beneath dust sheets and cobwebs. Stacks of furniture, portraits in gilt frames leaning against one another like gossiping relatives, crates labeled in fading ink, shelves sagging under books. Celtic pottery beside Victorian desks, boxes of jewelry beside china sets, a time capsule of half a century of lives and losses. I reached for the nearest object, a carved chest with brass fittings, its surface dulled by decades of neglect. Beneath my fingertips, the grain whispered quality. My training, long dormant, stirred awake. Before Jessica, before marriage, I had been Margaret Caldwell, assistant curator at the Minnesota History Museum. Artifacts had been my language, provenance my obsession. Seeing this trove was like hearing a forgotten dialect roll off my tongue again. Moira, I breathed. Do you realize what you're sitting on? That's why I brought you here, she replied. Her eyes held a glint of challenge. I've no idea what half of this is worth, but you might. Ever. We spent hours peeling back dust sheets. My fingers trembled over a complete Wedgwood china set, pristine, as if waiting for the right supper guests. I found leather-bound first editions whose spines cracked like brittle bones but whispered value. Then, wrapped in yellowing linens, a small porcelain figurine, its maker's mark instantly recognizable. Royal Doulton, I murmured, heart leaping. Early production. If authentic, a few £100 at least. Moira's brows shot up. For that wee thing? For that wee thing, I said, and laughed the first true laugh since Kilbride. The days settled into rhythm, mornings cataloging, item by item, number by number, my neat handwriting reclaiming order from chaos. Afternoons researching, the inn's Wi-Fi surprisingly robust for a village this small. Evenings at the pub, plotting next steps over soup and bread, locals nodding at me now as if I belonged. My fingernails were permanently dusty, my back ached from lifting, yet I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. And then, the painting. It was small, 18 inches by 12, but as I lifted it into the weak light, the colors flared with startling intensity. A highland landscape, rolling hills alive with detail. I bent closer, my curator's instinct kicking in. There, half obscured by grime, a signature. My heart thudded. A. Nasmyth. Alexander Nasmyth, father of Scottish landscape painting. Moira, I whispered. This could be worth thousands. We wrapped it carefully, reverent, and arranged a trip to Edinburgh. Her ancient Land Rover rattled like an old warhorse as we made the journey, the painting strapped like a sacred relic in the back. The authentication service was tucked in a converted warehouse in the old town. A woman my age, Dr. Catherine Murray, handled the canvas with practiced gentleness. I watched her tools, the magnifier, the ultraviolet light like a parishioner observing ritual. After what felt like hours, she looked up. It's authentic, she said simply. My breath caught. And the value? 15 to 20,000, assuming provenance checks out. Moira and I exchanged a glance that was equal parts glee and disbelief. Then Dr. Murray added the catch. One complication? Records show this painting was part of the Malaud estate collection, which went missing in the late 1982, likely sold privately to cover debts. Not unusual, but without documentation, its chain of ownership is murky. You'll need to do research before you can sell. On the drive back, drizzle streaking the windshield, I wasn't thinking of the complication. I was thinking of possibility. If one Nasmyth was buried in that warehouse, what else might be waiting? My fingers itched for the catalog, for the hunt. You're scheming, Moira teased, glancing sideways at me. I'm thinking, I corrected, about provenance, about organization, about how your warehouse might be the most valuable collection in Scotland. She grinned, the kind of grin that makes allies out of strangers. That night, back in my little room above the pub, I sat with my laptop, scrolling through estate records, auction listings, inheritance filings. My phone buzzed, a message from my sister in Minnesota, worried at my silence. "How are you? Call me." I stared at the words, then typed back slowly. "I'm doing better than I have in years." And for the first time since Jessica left me on the roadside, I knew it was true. The knock on my door came 6 weeks later, when the rain had settled into its usual Scottish rhythm, and the warehouse catalog was growing thick with pages of discoveries. Moira's face told me before her words did. Something unusual was downstairs. "There's a man waiting," she said, lowering her voice. "Says he knew your family." My family? That word had shrunk to mean only Jessica, and even that bond had been scorched. I followed her into the pub's small sitting room, where a man in his 70s rose to greet me. His hair was white, his face weathered by decades of Highland wind, but his handshake was firm. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said with a slight bow. "I'm Duncan Malaud. I believe we may be related." The name slammed into me like a dropped book. Malaud. The same name Dr. Murray had mentioned when speaking of the Nasmyth painting's murky provenance. "Please, sit," I managed. He opened a folder and laid out a spread of documents so old the ink itself looked weary. Marriage certificates, immigration papers, an inventory written in a careful hand. "Your great-grandmother, Margaret Malaud Caldwell," he said. "My great-aunt. In 1921, when she left Scotland for America, she took with her a dowry, including the Nasmyth. It was never stolen. It was given." I stared at the signatures, at the careful notations of jewelry, china, paintings. My hands trembled. "So it belonged to my family all along." "More than that," Duncan said gently. "By Scottish inheritance law, you're the sole surviving line. What your great-grandmother left behind legally belongs to you." I had come to Scotland thinking myself penniless and discarded. Now I was staring at a legacy I hadn't known existed. Within weeks, the proof was undeniable. Legal papers confirmed my claim. The Nasmyth went to auction at Sotheby's Edinburgh on a grey December afternoon. I stood in the hushed room, Moira at my side, my heart pounding as the numbers climbed. 8,000, 12, 16. At 25,000, Moira squeezed my hand. At 47,000, the gavel fell. One painting, more money than I had made in 2 years back in Minnesota, and it was only the beginning. The weeks blurred into a montage of discovery and validation. Edinburgh crystal sets that shimmered like frozen sunlight, £8,000. Victorian jewelry that sent collectors' pulses racing, 15,000. A library of 18th century Scottish volumes that brought 22,000. Each sale was another nail in the coffin of the woman Jessica had declared a burden. But the money was almost secondary. What mattered was the work, the rhythm, the pride. Moira and I became partners in more than name. By February, we sat together at a long oak table with blueprints and notebooks, planning the conversion of part of the warehouse into a proper showroom. "Malaud and Caldwell Antiquities," she suggested, and I felt something I hadn't in decades: ownership. My phone buzzed one evening as we argued over lighting fixtures. I glanced down, and the name froze me where I Saturday Jessica. 7 months of silence shattered in 2 syllables. "Answer it," Moira said quietly. I pressed the screen. "Hello, Jessica." Her voice was small, unsteady. "Mom, I've been trying to reach you. What Brian and I did, leaving you there, it was inexcusable." She poured out apologies, excuses about stress and fighting, promises that she wanted to make things right. I let the silence stretch. The old me would have rushed to soothe her. The new me let the weight of her words hang where they belonged. "Are you still in Scotland?" she asked finally. "I am." "Mom, please, come home. We miss you. Brian and I both miss you." But when I pressed why now, after 7 months, the truth slipped. She had seen the auction article, seen the photograph of me and Moira, smiling, wealthy, alive. Ah, so that was it. I ended the call with politeness carved from ice. But as I set the phone down, my hands trembled. Blood is a stubborn bond. A part of me still wanted to believe. 3 weeks later, a rental car crunched up the drive of our newly lit showroom. Jessica stepped out, Brian behind her, and then my heart nearly broke. The children, Emma and Tyler, running to me with cries of, "Grandma!" Emma leapt into my arms, her missing tooth flashing, and Tyler tried to act cool but hugged me hard. For a moment, it was almost perfect. Jessica walked into the showroom, eyes scanning the polished cases, the carefully lit displays. "This is not what I expected," she said, genuine awe in her voice. Moira appeared from the office, folder in hand, accent sharpened to a blade. "I'm Moira Maloud, Margaret's business partner." "Business partner?" Jessica echoed, her mask slipping for just a moment. We gave the children a tour, showing them dolls and dirks, silver and scrolls. Jessica followed, questions sugar-coated but eyes calculating. Over dinner that evening, she apologized again, spoke of therapy, of wanting to rebuild. She even took my hand. "I love you, Mom. I want us to be a real family again." The old Margaret would have wept with relief. The new Margaret felt the edges of the hook beneath the bait. That night, in the silence of the village, I heard voices outside the hotel where they stayed. Curious, I opened my window. Brian's voice, sharp, impatient. "This is a waste of time. She's not going to hand it over." Jessica's low and urgent. "She might. Did you see her face with the kids? She wants to believe we've changed. And if she doesn't, we move to plan B." My blood chilled. "What if she finds out?" Brian hissed. "She won't. And even if she does, who's going to believe her over us? One way or another, we're not leaving Scotland empty-handed." I shut the window, heart hammering, but my tears did not come. The old Margaret would have collapsed in grief. The new Margaret began to plan. Moira listened with arms crossed, her eyes narrowing as I recounted every word I had overheard outside the hotel. She didn't gasp, didn't sigh, just let a slow, hard smile spread across her face. "So," she said at last, "they think they can con you out of your own business?" I nodded, shame prickling even now. They came with apologies, with the children, with promises, and I wanted to believe them. I almost did. "Don't waste shame on yourself," Moira said sharply. "They used your love as a weapon. That's on them. But we'll use their greed against them." And so, the plan was born. It was elegant in its simplicity, cruel only in its truth. I would pretend to relent. I would agree to return to Minnesota with Jessica and Brian, but first I'd need to liquidate my share of the business and transfer the funds. Naturally, I would lean on their expertise in American banking. Naturally, they would help. What they didn't know was that every transfer, every account, every document had been crafted with our solicitor's careful hand. They wouldn't be stealing wealth, they'd be stealing bait and confessing while they did it. For the next week, Jessica and Brian played their roles to perfection. They hovered at my side as we boxed up items, our least valuable stock, spirited into storage while we claimed we were selling treasures. They sat at Moira's desk, heads bent close to mine, explaining how complicated international transfers could be. "Sometimes you have to route the money through multiple accounts first," Brian said, his tone patient, almost paternal. "Just temporarily, of course." I smiled, nodded, thanked him. Inside, my stomach turned at the familiarity of it, the slow grooming, the mask of care. I remembered the months she'd been siphoning my bank accounts, the forged signatures I hadn't seen until too late. And I reminded myself, not this time. On the 8th day, they insisted we set up a holding account for £200,000 fictional proceeds from our liquidation. Brian walked me through the paperwork, Jessica beaming beside him like a proud daughter. "This way, Mom," she said. You'll have everything secure for when you come back with us. A clean slate. I nodded, even as the solicitor across town prepared the case file that would prove their intent beyond denial. 3 days after they flew back to Minnesota, my phone rang at breakfast. Jessica's number. Mom, her voice shook. There's a problem. The accounts Brian set up, something's wrong. They're frozen. The bank says there's an investigation. I took a slow sip of my coffee. How strange, I said lightly. Suspicious activity, perhaps? I don't know. Brian's been on the phone for hours, but they won't explain. Maybe if you called your bank. And send the money to a different account? I asked, my voice like glass. Silence. Jessica, I continued, you didn't come to Scotland to make amends. You came because you thought I was rich, and you wanted to steal from me again. The apologies, the therapy story, the children, all of it was theater. And I nearly believed it. Nearly. Her breath came ragged. That's not true. I overheard you, I cut in. Plan B, not leaving empty-handed. Does that sound like love to you? More silence. Then a sob, faint, but it carried no weight. Once, it would have broken me. Now, it only confirmed what I already knew. Listen carefully, I said, steady and final. You will leave me alone. No more calls, no more visits, no more schemes. In exchange, I won't press charges for the fraud you just attempted. But if you contact me again, if you so much as step foot in Scotland, I will bring every shred of evidence to the authorities, and I will not hesitate. Mom, you can't. You were my daughter, I said, cutting her off one last time. Now you're just someone who shares my blood and covets my money, and that's not enough. I hung up. The silence afterward was not heavy, it was clean. Moira watched me from across the table, pride in her eyes. It's over, I said, and for the first time, I believed it. 6 months later, Maloud and Caldwell Antiquities was featured in a glossy magazine spread about Scotland's rising antique dealers. In the photo, Moira and I stood among treasures we had catalogued, authenticated, and sold with care. I wore a tailored suit I had bought myself, my hair silver but sharp, my smile steady. Word drifted across the Atlantic that Jessica and Brian had divorced, that money troubles had caught them at last. I did not rejoice, nor did I mourn. That chapter had ended. What remained were the letters I began to receive. Women, mostly. Strangers who had heard my story, who wrote of being drained by their own children, dismissed as burdens, made invisible in their own homes. I answered each one with the same words. It is never too late to begin again. You are stronger than you think. Because the truth was clear. Jessica thought she had abandoned me on that Highland road. In reality, she had set me free. 6 months slipped by like pages turning, each one inked with a kind of contentment I hadn't thought possible at 67. The warehouse had transformed into a showroom of polished wood, velvet ropes, and carefully lit displays. What had once been dust and forgotten trunks was now a living archive of Scotland's history and my livelihood. Moira and I stood side by side in the glossy photograph of the magazine feature, the caption calling us rising voices in the British antiques market. My silver hair shone under professional lights. My tailored suit was mine, bought with my own earnings, not a daughter's borrowed approval. I looked at that image and thought, this is who I always was, hidden under years of apologizing. Business thrived. Collectors came from Edinburgh and London, some even from abroad, drawn by the credibility of our research and the intimacy of our stories. Each item sold was not just an object, but a piece of narrative we had traced, verified, and cherished. A silver brooch tied to a Highland regiment, a carved chest that had crossed oceans twice. Provenance had become my compass, and through it, I felt my own lineage anchoring me at last. Jessica never called again. Not once. Linda, my sister, phoned occasionally with half-whispered updates. The divorce finalized. Brian blamed for financial troubles, though I suspected Jessica's fingerprints were all over them. Their children, my grandchildren, were said to be doing fine, shielded as best they could be. Sometimes I ached for Emma's gap-toothed smile, for Tyler's awkward half-hugs. But I reminded myself that love cannot flourish where manipulation is soil. What surprised me most were the letters. Dozens, then hundreds, arriving by email and post after the magazine article circulated. Women mostly, though some men too. Strangers who poured out stories of betrayal by their own children, of bank accounts drained, of being called burdens. They told me they felt seen, less alone, hearing that someone else had survived the cruelty that hides behind family ties. I replied to every single one, sometimes just a line, sometimes a page, always the same message at the core. It's never too late to start over. You are stronger than you think. Because I had learned something on that Highland road, suitcase in hand, wind at my back. Sometimes the worst thing that happens is the best disguised gift. Jessica believed she had abandoned me, stripped me of worth, of security, of dignity. What she actually gave me was freedom, a chance to reclaim my skills, my independence, myself. Now, when I stand in the showroom as light slants through the tall windows and gilds the antiques in honeygold, I feel the Highlands themselves have accepted me. Not as a stranded foreigner, but as a woman who belongs. And I know with certainty, I was never the burden. I was always the treasure,